Rex didn't bark, he growled at the wall. The wind moved low across the rocks, carrying that hollow, whispering sound that only lived in places no one cared to visit, the kind of land people forgot on purpose, and Jack Turner stood there with his boots planted in the dust, staring at what the county had called his inheritance, 6 acres of dry stone, broken ridges, and one shallow cut in the hillside that looked more like a wound than a property, something carved and then abandoned long before anyone thought to give it a price, and he exhaled slowly, adjusting the worn brim of his cap as the late afternoon sun dipped behind the ridge, turning everything the color of old copper, because useless land was still land, and after everything he'd seen, everything he'd walked away from, maybe quiet was exactly what he needed, but Rex wasn't moving. The German shepherd stood 10 feet ahead, muscles tight, ears forward, eyes locked on the rock face like it had just spoken to him, and then came that sound again, low, deep, not loud but certain, a growl that didn't belong to fear, it belonged to recognition, like he knew something was wrong before the world had caught up. Jack frowned, stepping closer, boots crunching against gravel. What is it, boy? His voice barely carried, because out here even sound felt heavy, like it didn't want to travel too far. Rex didn't look back, didn't wag, didn't shift, just stared at a single point in the wall where the stone changed color by half a shade, something no one else would ever notice unless they were looking for it, and Jack wasn't, not until now, not until that stillness settled in his chest, the kind that used to hit right before something went sideways, the kind he hadn't felt since the service, and he swallowed, stepping closer, close enough now to see the surface wasn't as natural as it first looked, too smooth in places, too clean where erosion should have left scars, and Rex let out a sharp breath. One step forward, paw lifting, then pressing against the rock. Scratching once, twice, not random, not playful, deliberate, and that's when Jack heard it, faint, almost nothing, but there, a hollow echo beneath the solid face. Like knocking on a door that had no handle, his jaw tightened, and he leaned in, placing his palm flat against the stone, feeling the cool surface, steady, unmoving, but wrong. Something about it didn't belong to time or weather, it belonged to intention, and behind him the wind picked up again, whispering through the gaps in the rocks, carrying dust across his boots, but Rex didn't move, didn't break. His entire body locked on that single point as if the rest of the world had faded out, and Jack slowly pulled his hand back, eyes narrowing, because he'd seen walls like this before, not out here, not in open land, but somewhere else, somewhere buried under orders and silence, and a thought settled heavy in his chest, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet realization that didn't ask permission before it arrived. This wasn't just a rock face, and whatever was behind it, wasn't meant to be found. Jack did not say anything for a long moment, and that silence stretched thin between him and the rock face like a wire pulled too tight, because part of him already knew what his mind was still trying to explain away, and that part did not like being proven right, not out here where things were supposed to be simple, just land and sky and wind, nothing buried, nothing hidden, nothing waiting. But Rex shifted again, a low sound still rolling in his chest, not louder, just deeper, and Jack finally straightened, stepping back 2 paces, boots scraping against loose stone as he glanced over his shoulder at the open stretch of land behind him, as if expecting someone else to be watching, though there was no one, no road in sight, no house within a mile, just the quiet weight of open space and a sky that had already begun to dim into evening, and he let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. It is just rock, he said under his breath, more to himself than the dog. Because saying it out loud made it easier to believe, made it sound reasonable, normal, and he nodded once as if that settled it, but Rex did not move, and that was the problem. Rex always moved when Jack moved, always followed, always checked back, except now, and that stillness pressed in again. Heavier this time, because it was not obedience keeping the dog there, it was certainty, and Jack had learned a long time ago to respect that kind of certainty, even when he did not understand it. He turned back slowly, eyes narrowing at the same patch of stone, forcing himself to look closer, not like a man glancing, but like a man inspecting, and the difference revealed things he had missed before. The edge where the rock met something smoother, the faint line that did not follow any natural pattern, too straight, too intentional, and he crouched down, lowering himself until he was eye level with the surface, fingers brushing along the edge, tracing it carefully, and there it was again, that hollow echo when his knuckles tapped lightly, not loud, not obvious, but wrong, unmistakably wrong, like knocking on something that had space behind it, and his jaw tightened as memory stirred without invitation, not a clear picture. Just fragments, a reinforced wall, a sealed entry, orders that were never written down but always understood, and he pulled his hand back quickly, as if the stone had grown colder, because this was not the place for that, not here, not now, and yet the resemblance would not let go. Rex scratched again, sharper this time, and a small piece of dust broke loose, sliding down the surface in a thin line, exposing a slightly different texture beneath, not rough like the rest, but smoother, almost like poured concrete weathered over time, and Jack stared at it, longer than he meant to, longer than was comfortable, until finally he stood up, slow and deliberate, brushing his hands against his jeans as if that could wipe away the thought forming in his mind. "We are not doing this tonight," he said quietly, voice steady but low, because the light was fading and whatever this was, it was not something to rush, not something to stumble into without thinking. And Rex turned his head slightly at that, just enough to look back at him, not disobeying, but not agreeing either, and for a second it felt like the dog was waiting, giving him the chance to walk away, to leave it buried like it had been for years, maybe decades, and Jack held that look, feeling the weight of the choice settle in his chest, because walking away would be easy, closing the door on it before it even opened, but staying meant stepping into something he could not yet see, something that had already begun to reach back toward him, and the wind picked up again, moving through the rocks with that same low whisper, brushing past his ears like a voice he could almost understand but not quite, and he exhaled slowly, turning away at last, taking a step back toward the path that led down the ridge, and after a brief pause, Rex followed, but not before glancing once more at the wall, as if marking it, remembering it, and Jack did not look back, not then, but the image stayed with him all the way down the slope, that single unnatural line in the stone, that hollow sound beneath it, and the quiet certainty that whatever was behind that wall had not been meant to stay hidden forever. Jack did not sleep much that night, and when he did, it came in short stretches that never settled, the kind that left his body still while his mind kept moving, circling the same image over and over again, that faint line in the rock, that hollow sound beneath it, and each time he closed his eyes it sharpened just a little more, until it no longer felt like imagination but memory trying to surface. And by the time the first gray light slipped through the thin curtains of the cabin, he was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed with his boots on, hands resting on his knees as Rex lay nearby, alert but quiet, watching him the way he always did when something was not right, and Jack exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand across his jaw before standing, because ignoring it had not worked, walking away had not worked, and whatever that wall was, it was not going to let him forget it, not after what he had felt, what he had heard, and outside the air was colder than the day before. Sharp enough to bite through his jacket as the sun pushed its way over the ridge, casting long shadows across the uneven ground, and Jack moved with purpose now, not rushed, not careless, but deliberate, the way he had learned to move when something required attention, each step measured, each glance taking in more than just the obvious, and Rex was already ahead of him, leading without looking back, cutting across the slope toward that same place like there had never been a question of returning, and when they reached the rock face again, it felt different in the morning light, clearer, less hidden, and yet somehow more exposed, as if daylight had stripped away any illusion that it was natural. And Jack stood there for a moment, just looking, letting the details settle in, the unnatural smoothness, the faint seam that ran too straight to belong to erosion, and he set his jaw, stepping closer before crouching down again, this time bringing a small metal tool from his pocket, nothing fancy, just something solid enough to test what he needed to know, and he pressed it lightly against the surface, tapping once, then again, listening, not just hearing, but listening the way he had been trained to do, picking up the difference between solid earth and something constructed, and there it was, clearer now in the still morning air, a hollow resonance that did not belong, and Rex let out a low sound beside him, not impatient, not aggressive, just confirming, and Jack nodded slightly, more to himself than anything, because that was enough, more than enough, and he shifted his grip, applying a little more pressure, scraping at the edge where the texture changed, and small grains broke loose, falling away to reveal a thin line beneath, gray. Uniform, unmistakably man-made, and his breath slowed as the realization settled deeper, because this was not just a wall, it was placed here, built here, intentionally hidden, and the thought that followed was quieter, heavier, because if someone had gone through the effort to seal this, then whatever was behind it had mattered, enough to be buried, enough to be forgotten, and Jack leaned back slightly, eyes scanning the surrounding rock, looking for anything else that did not fit, and there were more signs now that he knew where to look, subtle, but there, a slight shift in alignment, a pattern that repeated just enough to betray itself, and he stood again, brushing his hands off as he took a step back. Measuring the space with his eyes, the height, the width, the depth of what could be hidden behind it, and Rex moved closer to the center point, placing his paw against it again, steady, certain, and Jack let out a slow breath, the kind that comes before a decision you cannot take back, because this was no longer about curiosity, it was about truth, and truth had a way of pulling you in whether you wanted it or not. And he looked out across the empty land for a moment, as if expecting the silence to answer him, but it did not, it only stretched on, vast and indifferent, and when he turned back to the wall, there was no hesitation left, just a quiet resolve forming where doubt had been, because whatever was behind that barrier had been waiting a long time, and for reasons he could not yet explain, it had chosen now to be found. Jack did not rush, and that was the difference now, because rushing was how mistakes happened, and whatever this was, it deserved more than impulse, so he walked the perimeter first, slow and methodical, counting his steps without realizing it, measuring distance the way old habits never quite let go, roughly 12 feet across, maybe a little more, and about 8 feet high at its tallest point where the rock curved naturally above it, except the curve stopped just short of the seam, like the wall had been fitted into something older, something that had been here long before anyone thought to hide anything inside it, and he crouched again, this time closer to the ground, brushing away loose dust and small stones with his hand until the base of the surface revealed itself more clearly, and there it was, faint but undeniable, a straight edge meeting packed earth, not jagged, not broken, but set, placed with intention, and his chest tightened slightly as the pattern completed itself in his mind, because this was not random, this was built, sealed, and left, and Rex moved beside him, pressing his nose near the same edge, inhaling slowly, then pulling back just enough to look at Jack again, and there was something in that look, something steady and unshaken, as if the dog had already decided what this was long before Jack allowed himself to. And Jack nodded once, barely noticeable, then reached into the back pocket of his pack and pulled out a heavier tool, nothing industrial, just a compact hammer with enough weight to test more than just the surface, and he turned it in his hand for a moment, feeling the balance, grounding himself in the simple, physical reality of it, before stepping forward and raising it slightly, not high, not aggressive, just enough to bring it down with controlled force against the same spot Rex had marked. And the sound that followed was not sharp, not solid, but hollow, deeper than before, echoing back through the handle and into his palm, and he froze for half a second, because that sound was confirmation, and confirmation carried weight, the kind that shifted things from possibility into truth, and he lowered the hammer slowly, eyes fixed on the surface as if expecting it to respond, but it did not, it remained still, unchanged except for a faint dust mark where the impact had been, and Jack exhaled through his nose, then lifted the hammer again, this time bringing it down just slightly harder, and a thin crack formed, not spreading wide, not dramatic, just enough to break the illusion of a single piece, and a small fragment chipped away, tumbling down and landing at his boot, revealing beneath it a smooth gray layer that had nothing to do with natural stone. And his grip tightened instinctively as his mind caught up with what his eyes were seeing, concrete, aged but intact, sealed over time and hidden behind a facade meant to disappear into the landscape, and he stepped back, lowering the hammer completely now as the weight of that realization settled in, because this was not an accident, not an abandoned structure, this was deliberate concealment, and he glanced out across the land again, scanning the empty horizon as if expecting it to suddenly feel different, but it did not, it remained quiet, indifferent, as if it had been keeping this secret without ever caring who eventually found it, and Rex let out a soft exhale, stepping closer to the crack, paw lifting again but this time resting gently against the exposed edge, not scratching, not pushing, just touching it. Like he was confirming something that had already been decided, and Jack watched him for a second, then looked back at the wall, the seam now clearer than before, the line no longer something you had to search for but something you could not ignore, and a thought settled in his mind, steady and unshaken. This was only the surface, whatever was behind it was still waiting, still sealed. And he knew then that this was not going to be a single strike or a quick reveal, this was going to take time. Effort, and a decision to keep going past the point where most people would stop, and he tightened his jaw slightly, lifting the hammer once more but not swinging it yet, just holding it there as he measured the space again, planning without words, because once he started opening this, there would be no pretending it was just rock anymore, no stepping back into ignorance, and the wind shifted again, brushing past his shoulders, carrying that same low whisper through the gaps in the hillside. And for a brief moment it almost sounded like something behind the wall answering back, not loud, not clear, but present, and Jack lowered the hammer just a fraction, eyes narrowing as he listened, because whatever had been sealed here was not just hidden, it was waiting to be heard. Jack lowered the hammer slowly, not because he had changed his mind, but because something in the air had shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of shift you did not see but felt in your chest first, and he stood there for a moment, listening, not to the wind this time, but to the absence of it, because the hillside had gone strangely still, like the land itself was holding its breath, and Rex noticed it too, his ears flicking back for a split second before locking forward again, body stiffening in a way that had nothing to do with the wall anymore, and Jack turned his head slightly, eyes scanning the ridge above them, the open stretch of rock and dry brush that had been empty just minutes ago, and for a second everything looked the same, unchanged, harmless even, but then he saw it, not movement exactly, more like a disruption in pattern, a faint line where the dust had been disturbed along the upper slope, too straight, too recent to belong to wind alone, and his grip tightened instinctively around the handle of the hammer as his posture shifted without thought, shoulders angling, weight adjusting, every sense narrowing toward that one detail, because something had been there, or still was, just out of sight, and Rex let out a low sound, deeper now, not directed at the wall but toward the ridge, and Jack exhaled slowly through his nose, forcing calm into his movements as he stepped back from the concrete surface, creating distance, not retreating, just repositioning, and his eyes stayed locked on that same line in the dust, watching for confirmation, for anything that would turn suspicion into certainty, but nothing moved, nothing revealed itself, and the silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, the kind that made your thoughts louder than they should be, and he shook his head once, barely, grounding himself again, because land shifted, dust moved, and not everything meant something, and yet the feeling did not leave, it settled deeper instead, quiet but persistent, like a warning that had not finished speaking, and Rex stepped closer to him now, no longer focused on the wall, pressing lightly against his leg in a way that was not fear, but awareness, shared and unspoken, and Jack glanced down at him for a second before looking back toward the ridge, then slowly back at the wall, caught between 2 points of attention, both demanding it for different reasons, and he let out a breath, longer this time, as the decision formed without needing to be spoken, because whatever this place was, it was no longer just about what was hidden behind the concrete, it was about who might already know it was here, and that changed things, not dramatically, not yet, but enough to matter, and he stepped forward again, closer to the wall, running his hand along the exposed edge where the gray layer showed through, feeling the cold, uniform surface beneath his fingers, solid, unyielding, built to last, and his eyes narrowed slightly as he followed the seam upward, tracing it higher until it disappeared into the natural curve of the rock, and he stepped back again, widening his view, mapping it out in his mind piece by piece, the height, the width, the depth it suggested, and something about it clicked into place, not a full memory, not yet, but a structure, a pattern that his instincts recognized even if his thoughts had not caught up, and Rex returned to the same spot once more, placing his paw gently against the cracked section, holding it there, steady and certain, as if reminding him where to focus, and Jack nodded slightly, then shifted his grip on the hammer again, this time raising it with more intention, because hesitation had already cost him enough time, and whatever was here had already begun to surface, whether he wanted it to or not, and he brought the hammer down again, controlled but firm, widening the crack just enough for another small piece to break free, and this time the sound echoed deeper, clearer, carrying through the surface and back into his hand in a way that confirmed what he had been avoiding since the moment Rex first growled. There was space behind this wall, real space, not inches, but feet, maybe more, and he paused, holding the hammer still as that realization settled fully into place, because space meant something had been built, something had been placed, and something had been sealed away, and he looked at Rex again, just for a second, and the dog met his gaze without hesitation, as if the answer had been there all along, waiting for him to accept it, and Jack turned back to the wall. Jaw set, shoulders steady, because whatever was on the other side was no longer just a question, it was a certainty, and he had already crossed the point where walking away was possible. Jack did not swing again right away, and that pause was not hesitation anymore, it was calculation, the kind that settled in after a line had already been crossed, and he stood there with the hammer resting at his side, eyes fixed on the widening crack as the morning light shifted across it, revealing more than it had just minutes before, because now that the surface had been broken, the illusion was gone, and what remained was structure, clear and undeniable, a layer of concrete poured with purpose, aged but intact, and behind it that hollow space waited, quiet and patient, as if it had never expected to be disturbed but was not surprised that it finally had been, and Rex moved slightly to the side, giving Jack space without stepping away completely, his body angled now toward both the wall and the ridge above, dividing his attention in a way that told Jack everything he needed to know without a single sound. They were not alone in this anymore, not entirely, and Jack let that settle without reacting to it outwardly, because reacting too quickly was how you gave something away, even when you could not see who or what you were reacting to, and he lifted the hammer again, this time bringing it down with a steady rhythm, not forceful, not reckless, but consistent, controlled impacts that chipped away at the surface piece by piece, each strike sending small fragments down to the ground, each one exposing more of the gray beneath. And the sound changed with each hit, shifting from dull resistance to a clearer, deeper echo that confirmed what his instincts had already accepted. There was a cavity behind this, a space large enough to carry sound, large enough to hold something more than just air, and his breathing remained even as he worked, steady and measured, but inside his thoughts had begun to align into something sharper, because the pattern was familiar now, not in detail, but in design, the way the seam was placed, the way the material had been layered, the way it blended just enough with the natural rock to avoid notice. It was not random, it was intentional concealment, the kind used when something needed to be hidden without leaving a trace, and that recognition did not come from guesswork, it came from memory, buried deep but still intact, and he slowed slightly, lowering the hammer as he leaned in closer, eyes narrowing at a small section near the edge where the concrete met the surrounding stone, and there, barely visible beneath the dust and time, was a marking, faint, worn, but precise, a straight line intersected by a shorter one, forming a symbol that meant nothing to most people but everything to someone who had seen it before, and Jack froze for a fraction of a second, not outwardly, not in a way that anyone else would notice, but internally, where recognition hit like a quiet confirmation rather than a shock, and he reached out, brushing his fingers lightly over the marking, clearing just enough dust to make it clearer, and his jaw tightened as the past closed the distance between then and now without asking permission, because this was not just a hidden space, this was a constructed seal, the kind used for storage, for containment, for things that were not meant to be accessed without intention, and he pulled his hand back slowly, standing upright again as the weight of that understanding settled into place, and Rex stepped closer once more, pressing his nose near the same marking before looking up at Jack, waiting, not urging, just present, and Jack exhaled through his nose, long and steady, because now the question was no longer what this was, but why it had been left here, and more importantly, why it had not been removed. And he glanced once more toward the ridge, that same faint disturbance still lingering in the back of his awareness, not confirmed, not proven, but not dismissed either, and then he turned back to the wall, grip tightening again around the hammer as resolve replaced uncertainty, because whatever had been sealed behind this was not just forgotten, it had been placed here deliberately, and the fact that it was still here meant something had interrupted whatever plan had once existed for it, and that made it unfinished, and unfinished things had a way of resurfacing, one way or another, and he raised the hammer again, this time without pause, bringing it down in a steady sequence that widened the opening further, piece by piece, until a small section gave way completely, revealing not just gray concrete, but a darker void just beyond it, a narrow glimpse into the space behind, and he stopped, lowering the hammer as he leaned in slightly, eyes adjusting to the shadow within, because for The first time, it was no longer just a theory, it was visible, real, and waiting, and behind him the wind moved again, low and quiet, carrying that same whisper through the rocks, but this time it no longer sounded distant, it sounded close, like something that had been sealed away was finally beginning to breathe again. Jack did not move right away after the opening appeared, and that stillness was not fear, it was recognition, the kind that comes when something shifts from unknown to real, and he leaned in just slightly, enough for the light to angle into the narrow gap, revealing only darkness beyond, not empty, but dense, as if the space itself had weight, and the air that slipped out through the crack carried a faint difference, cooler, older, untouched by wind or sun for a long time, and Rex stepped forward immediately, lowering his head, nose close to the opening, inhaling slowly, then pausing as if sorting through something invisible, something layered deep within that stale air, and Jack watched him carefully, because Rex did not react without reason, and when the dog pulled back just enough to glance up at him, there was no confusion there, only certainty, the same steady awareness that had led them here in the first place. And Jack exhaled slowly, shifting his stance as he crouched down again, this time closer than before, bringing his eye level with the opening, trying to see past the surface into whatever waited behind it, but the light only reached so far, fading quickly into shadow, and for a moment it felt like looking into something that did not want to be seen, not resisting, just remaining out of reach, and he raised his hand, hesitating just briefly before extending it toward the edge of the gap. Fingers brushing against the inside surface, and the texture was different there, smoother, colder, unmistakably constructed, not carved, not natural, and his jaw tightened slightly as the structure took shape in his mind, not fully, not yet, but enough to understand that this space had been designed, not discovered, and behind him Rex shifted again, this time turning sharply toward the ridge above, body stiffening, ears locked forward as a low sound rolled through his chest, deeper than before. And Jack's head turned instantly, eyes snapping toward the same direction, scanning the slope with sharper focus now, because that feeling from earlier had not left, it had only grown quieter, more patient, and now it pressed forward again, demanding attention, and there it was, not movement exactly, but a presence, subtle, just beyond the edge of visibility, a faint shift in the way the light caught along the rocks, something that did not belong to the wind or the land. And Jack slowly stood, not turning his back on the opening, not fully committing to either direction, but balancing between them, one hand still resting near the wall, the other lowering the hammer just enough to keep it ready, and the silence stretched again, heavier now, as if the space behind the wall and the unseen presence above the ridge were connected by something he could not yet understand, and Rex let out another low growl, softer this time but more focused, and Jack took a slow step backward, repositioning himself so he could see both the opening and the ridge without turning. Because whatever this was, it was no longer just about discovery, it was about timing, about awareness, and he did not intend to be caught unaware, and for a long second nothing changed, the ridge remained still, the air quiet, the opening behind him dark and waiting, and then the wind returned, subtle at first, brushing across the rocks and carrying dust along the slope, and whatever had been there, if anything had been there, dissolved back into the landscape, leaving no clear sign, no confirmation, just that lingering sense that something had noticed him, and Jack exhaled slowly, not relaxing, but recalibrating, because uncertainty did not mean safety, it only meant the situation had not revealed itself yet, and he turned back toward the wall, eyes narrowing as he focused on the opening again, because whatever was behind it had been sealed for a reason, and now that it had been disturbed, it was no longer isolated, and he stepped forward once more, lowering himself carefully as he reached for a small flashlight from his pack, clicking it on with a soft snap before angling the beam into the gap, and the light cut through the darkness just enough to reveal the first hint of what lay beyond, not fully, not clearly, but enough to confirm shape, structure, and depth, and he held there, steady, breath slow, because the space behind that wall was no longer hidden, it was beginning to reveal itself, piece by piece, and whatever had been waiting inside was no longer alone. The beam of the flashlight did not reach the back of the space, and that was the first thing that told Jack this was larger than he had expected, because the light should have bounced back quickly in a shallow cavity, but instead it stretched forward and faded, swallowed by depth, revealing only fragments along the way, a flat surface here, a vertical edge there, lines that did not belong to nature but to design, and he adjusted the angle slightly, narrowing the beam to focus deeper, and this time it caught something more defined, a straight corner, sharp and deliberate, forming the edge of what looked like a corridor or a chamber, and his breath slowed without him noticing, because that shape, that geometry, it was familiar in a way that went beyond memory, it was instinct, and Rex shifted beside him, stepping closer until his shoulder pressed lightly against Jack's arm, not out of fear but alignment, as if both of them were now facing the same unknown together, and Jack leaned in a fraction more, careful not to widen the opening yet, not to disturb anything further than necessary, because whatever air had been sealed inside had already begun to move, and with it came a faint scent, not strong, not unpleasant, just old, like paper left untouched for years or metal that had sat in still air too long, and it triggered something quiet in his mind, something tied to places built to last without being seen, and he exhaled slowly, shifting his grip on the flashlight as he swept it lower, tracing the floor just beyond the opening, and there, beneath a thin layer of dust, were marks, not footprints, not recent, but impressions left long ago, faint lines and scuffs that suggested movement, activity, a space that had once been used before it was sealed away, and his jaw tightened slightly as the idea formed more clearly now. This was not just storage, this was a constructed interior, something with purpose, something that had existed fully before it had been hidden, and Rex lowered his head again, sniffing near the base of the opening before pausing, ears flicking once as if catching something beyond scent, something quieter, and Jack noticed it immediately, the subtle change in the dog's posture, the slight tension that returned to his frame, and he pulled the flashlight back just enough to glance over his shoulder toward the ridge again, because that presence, that feeling of being observed, had not disappeared, it had only retreated, and the land remained still, unchanged, but the awareness lingered, and he turned back to the opening, narrowing his focus again, because whatever was out there could wait, this could not, and he raised the light once more, angling it higher this time, and that was when he saw it, faint but unmistakable, a surface on the inner wall that reflected just enough to catch the beam, not natural stone, not raw concrete, but something smoother, coated, and as the light steadied, shapes began to emerge from the darkness, edges of objects lined against the wall, rectangular forms stacked or placed with intention, and his pulse slowed further, not from calm but from concentration, because each detail added weight to the realization building in his mind. This was organized, deliberate, preserved, and he held the light there, steady, letting his eyes adjust as more of the interior revealed itself piece by piece. And for a moment the outside world seemed to fall away, the wind, the ridge, the empty land. All of it fading behind the quiet gravity of what lay inside, and Rex remained at his side, unmoving now, gaze fixed on the opening as if he understood that whatever came next mattered, and Jack exhaled slowly, lowering the flashlight just a fraction as his free hand moved toward the edge of the broken concrete, fingers resting there as he felt the boundary between outside and inside, between what had been hidden and what was now exposed, and he knew then that this was no longer just an opening. It was an entrance, and once he crossed it, even partially, there would be no stepping back into not knowing, and the light in his hand steadied again as he angled it deeper into the space, because whatever had been left here had waited long enough, and now it was finally being seen. Jack did not step inside immediately, and that hesitation was not doubt, it was respect for the threshold he now stood before, because the moment his hand shifted from resting on the edge to applying pressure, even slightly, the boundary between outside and inside would no longer exist in the same way, and he remained still for a second longer, flashlight steady, beam cutting into the dim space beyond, tracing the outlines that had begun to reveal themselves, and Rex stayed close, shoulder pressed against his leg, not pulling him forward, not holding him back, just present, and that presence grounded him in a way nothing else could, because whatever this place had been, whatever it still was, it was no longer just something buried in the land, it was something that had reached out and found him, and he exhaled slowly, shifting his weight forward as his hand moved from the outer edge to the inner surface, fingers brushing against the cold, smooth wall just beyond the broken concrete, and the temperature difference was immediate, subtle but clear, the air inside cooler, still, untouched by the movement of the outside world, and he leaned in slightly, enough for his shoulder to pass the line of the opening, not fully entering, but crossing just enough to see more clearly, and the beam of the flashlight followed, sweeping slowly from left to right, revealing more of the interior with each inch of movement, the flat walls, the straight lines, the deliberate construction that stood in quiet contrast to the natural rock outside, and then it caught something that made him pause, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise, a metal surface, dull with age but intact, reflecting just enough light to stand out against the darker surroundings, and as he steadied the beam, the shape became clearer, a storage case, rectangular, reinforced, placed carefully against the wall as if it had been meant to remain undisturbed, and beside it, another. And another, arranged with intention, not scattered, not abandoned, but preserved, and Jack felt something shift in his chest, not surprise, not shock, but confirmation of a truth that had been forming since the first crack appeared. This was not random, this was a place built to hold something important, something worth hiding, and he stepped forward just a fraction more, enough for his other hand to reach inside, hovering just above the nearest case without touching it, because even now, even after everything, he understood that some things were not meant to be disturbed without understanding what they were first, and Rex moved closer, nose lowering toward the ground just inside the opening, inhaling slowly, then lifting his head again as if acknowledging the space, accepting it, and Jack glanced down at him briefly before returning his focus to the interior, and the light shifted again, moving further back, and that was when he saw it, not large, not obvious, but unmistakable, a marking on the far wall, clearer than the one outside, preserved by the stillness of the sealed space, sharp lines intersecting in a pattern that carried meaning, and his breath slowed again as recognition settled in fully now, not fragments, not impressions, but clarity, because he had seen that symbol before, not here, not in this place, but in another time, another setting, one that had been closed, filed away, and never spoken of again, and he held the light steady on it, the beam unwavering as the past and present aligned in a way that left no room for doubt, and behind him the wind moved softly across the rocks. Distant now, separate from the stillness inside, and Rex remained at his side, quiet, steady, as if understanding that this moment was not about discovery anymore, it was about recognition, and Jack lowered the flashlight just slightly, eyes still fixed on the symbol as his hand rested lightly against the inner wall, feeling the reality of it beneath his fingertips. Because whatever had been hidden here had not been forgotten by accident, it had been left, deliberately, and for reasons he had not yet uncovered. It had remained untouched until now, until this moment, and as he stood there between the open land behind him and the sealed space before him, one thing became clear without needing to be spoken: this was only the beginning of something that had started long before he arrived, and whatever it was not finished yet.